Hi, Ash. Welcome to meaningoflife.tv. It's good to have you on. Let me just introduce us. I'm Philip Menchaca. I'm project coordinator at Union Theological Seminary. I'm one of the folks who works on Meaning of Life. And you are Ash Yezuita, my friend and a Teach for America survivor.
That I am.
That you are. One of those credentials being more impressive than the other. But we're not here to talk about any of that. You are a practicing pagan, Norse pagan for the past couple years, practicing pagan before that for, about 12 years?
12 years.
And so we are going to talk about that today.
Cool.
We're going to talk about what Norse paganism is, what that means and the practices it entails. And then I'd like to get into more broadly how it kind of fits into the larger social landscape, specifically kind of the creepy adoption by some white supremacists of Norse paganism.
Absolutely. That's a thing.
Yeah. So to start with, I just get straight on a couple terms that I've heard it described. You said that you were Norse pagan. That's how you described it to me. I've heard a few other labels like asatru and Odinism. And is there a difference between those? Or are they kind of just different labels for the same thing?
Yeah. So I would say that a lot of people debate when they get interested and involved in Norse paganism how to label, because so many labels come with either positive or negative baggage. Odinism, for instance, is a great example. Very frequently, folks that when you first hear of Odinism, a lot of the adoptees of this branch, I guess you would say, come from a background of being pro-folkish, which would...
Pro-folkish?
Folkish,
F-O-L-K.
F-O-L-K, which is the idea that you need to have lineage from Nordic countries or Germanic countries to practice Norse paganism. So it is an exclusive, lineage. Yes, it's a racial, ethnic lineage or cut that says that you can practice. So if you don't have family from Germany or, the Netherlands, then you are not allowed to practice. Of course, what many people see is if you're generally white and maybe European, nobody questions it. Nobody is telling the Irish guy you're not allowed to practice. So Odinism has a lot of baggage. I have met one Odinist that is a follower of Odin, which is where the term comes from, and really fights against that label that Odinists are racist or Odinism is inherently pro-hate and pro-separatism. And she just sees it as kind of a reclaimed term that her, patron deity, I would use that term kind of loosely, but the deity that she focuses most on and most of her offerings are dedicated to is Odin. Okay. And that doesn't mean anything for her politics or anything like that. Asatru, again, it's the much more put together branch of Norse paganism. There's a lot of Norse pagans that are practicing on their own. I am not joined to any groups or affiliated with any groups. Asatru kind of wanted people to find others like them. So you can find Asatru gatherings and meet other Norse pagans. And then from that, a lot of times you have a little kind of group that you can go to, kind of how Wiccans have covens.
Right.
Not that they're like exclusively the same, but they'll do different rites and rituals together and kind of celebrate the calendar year together and things like that. They also have an entire, what's it called? Like a moral code called the 9 Noble Virtues.
Oh, okay.
That they then follow and apply to their practice. And that's not from antiquate, like it's not historically accurate, but it's taking
these
ideas and trying to create what would the 9 noble virtues be, or what would the doctrine of morale be in Viking times based on what we know.
Okay.
So there's that part. Asatru's a little more, I would say, put together.
It's the organized side of things.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then within Asatru, you have folks that are anti-hate heathens, anti-discrimination. Anyone can join. They're called the Troth. I think they're wonderful. A wonderful group. There are definitely some debates for other Norse pagans with some of their practices, but that gets into a lot of spiritual focus on the gods and the role that the gods play. Like Loki is a very hot button issue in Norse paganism, and whether or not he can be worshipped as a god and invited and invoked and welcomed to ceremonies, or if because he's a chaotic god, he's not allowed there. So that's a big. Asatru says no. There are pagans who are Lokian, so they don't like Asatru, and
so
a lot of inner politics.
Let's get into that a little bit about just kind of the foundational beliefs of this, and we're just so. I mean, from what you said, it's clear that there's, as with all kinds of labels, there's a lot of politics that goes along.
Lots of politics.
So we'll just stick with Norse paganism for now. That's what you identify as, correct?
Yes.
So we'll just stick with that. So if you had to give kind of like an elevator speech for Norse paganism, a kind of short summary of what it is, if that's possible, what they believe, and a description of what it is, can you do that?
Yeah. So Norse paganism or Norse polytheism is the pagan practices as connected to the Norse gods. So the key players in Norse gods that people know are Thor and Odin, Freya. Think of the comic book. I personally think Norse paganism probably got super popular because of that comic book and those movies. Hey, we all find faith somehow. And I think the core tenets, I personally identify more as a reconstructionist. So it's looking at what folks in those times, in like the Viking ages, would have practiced. So a big focus on the home and hearth and taking care of family and community, but also exploration. Odin is known to be a god of knowledge. On top, like above all else, he sacrificed his sight to be able to gain access to knowledge. So there's also this part of it that is very pro education. And as a teacher, one cannot avoid that. So yeah,
the patron god of teachers.
Patron god of teachers, Odin. Probably not, kind of scary, but yeah, I think the biggest thing is applying pagan practices, and then using the texts that we have on Viking Age and the antiquated religions of, I don't know if antiquated was the right word, but the land religions from Germany and that region.
Okay.
Which we are like focusing on 2 separate regions, but because Vikings are such a traveling group, they kind of like subsumed each other. Like there is a separation between Germanic paganism and Norse paganism, but that's getting into a lot of like really specific deities and like the diaspora of.
So is there evidence in the historical texts, records that we have, these sources, that there was religious exchange between Germanic peoples and Vikings, for instance?
Yeah, so there's definitely historical evidence of just the way in which the gods kind of took on each other in a way. I know that people explain it like with Greek and Roman very simply, like, oh, well, so-and-so is so-and-so. And of course there are like Artemis and Diana. And of course there are differences between that based on their cultural heritage, and just it was a different time, quite literally. But that is seen very heavily between Norse paganism and Germanic paganism, to where there's a lot of conversation on, oh, well, Freya and Frigga and Holly may very well all be the same goddess, just in a variety of forms, depending where you're finding the information. A lot of the records are also lost, and a lot of what we have about the religion, in terms of like the religion of the Vikings or the religion of that time, was rewritten by Christians hundreds of years later. So it's very confusing on what was true, what wasn't true. These translated texts, the prose Edda, the poetic Edda, were translated and pieced together by, you know, this really great historian, but also had his own background, being a Christian, like of Christian faith, and also like a practicing like monk.
Yeah, that's interesting. You see this in other kinds of other religions that have been pieced together by Christians, for instance, like the Mesoamerican religions. It's very difficult to figure out what the actual practices and beliefs were, because a lot of it has been reinterpreted kind of in garbled ways through the missionaries.
Right. And that, I think, is definitely the case for Norse paganism. And on top of it, in modern times, looking at the 1970s and on, when Norse paganism kind of became an option again, of course, people are going to have their own modern interpretations, regardless, because none of us truly know exactly what they meant. And when you're translating antiquated text, you just need to use whoever was brilliant enough to translate it and trust their translation skills.
So there's a lot of faith going on here.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of, we'll see what this means, and we'll interpret as needed.
Okay, so it's explicitly a polytheistic, right? It's not.
Yes. Okay,
so it's not monaltristic, like where you acknowledge the existence of other gods, but worship only one. There's worship of.
They kind of come as a package.
Okay, and so who would the major gods be? Odin and Freya.
You have Odin, Frigga. You have Heimdall. You have Freya. You have Thor, of course. You have Balder, Tyr. So they're in Norse paganism. The world of Norse paganism has two sects of gods, if you will, like two groups, the Vanir and the Aesir. And in modern translation, the easiest way is like there's the group of the fighting gods, and then there are the not fighting gods. And that's not actually the case, because Freya is in the group of the Vanir, which are supposed to be the friendlier gods, but she has first pick of the warrior dead. Before Odin even. She gets choice prime of the slain Viking dead. So even though she's in this group of the nice ones, that's not a clear separation.
What do you mean by pick of? She like what's the idea? Is that if someone dies, then you get it taken up by a god?
So a lot of people know of the myth or the mythos around Valhalla, right? So you die and you get to forever drink and fight and die in those fights, and then be reborn in this what people have translated to like Viking heaven, which is again this applying of like Christian ideology to something that was pre-Christian influence. So it's not really a great explanation, but there are a number of levels of what can happen to you when you die. You have Valhalla, which is seen over by Odin. You also have Freya's realm, and she will take her pick of the warriors that were slain in battle. So you have to, like, to get into there, you need to have certain qualification. You need to be a fighter. You need to be a warrior. You need to have died in battle. These are kind of like if these apply to you, either one of these gods are going to take their pick. And then you have a number of different possibilities then based on, the many people who are not a warrior. An interesting thing about the afterlife, I guess, of Norse paganism is also women who die in labor could get chosen by Freya to go into the warriors, like her warriors' hall. So the connection in terms of family and what is, what happens to you when you die if you die in birth as giving birth as a woman is something that's super interesting, not entirely fleshed out, but really fascinating. So I think a lot of research has been done, not from a Norse pagan standpoint, but from Icelandic historians and anthropologists kind of looking at what that means and how they viewed women in their society, positively, negatively, which I know, is fascinating in a way for any culture when you're trying to piece together, like, were women treated well? Were they not? What were the roles of women in society? But then you go all the way down to where you have Hel, and the goddess Hel runs over kind of her domain, which in some sense in the Christian view of hell, which if I'm not entirely wrong is where they pulled that term, the Christian term of hell
came from.
And Hela is a very odd connection. What came first? I'm not smart enough to know. I don't have that information. People have argued either way. And it was not necessarily where the bad people go, but it was definitely the less honorable.
So
because
cosmology, you would have kind of three divisions. Is that correct? Christianity, to use a rough.
Yeah, there's more than three.
Okay, but so there's Valhalla, which is kind of like the Norse heaven, honorable death. You go there. There's Earth, which is, I guess, the realm that we are currently in, as far as we know. And then there's
we think,
and then there's this hell realm.
Yeah, so there's 9 realms.
Oh, there's 9. Okay, so there's not 3.
In Norse paganism, there's 9. You also get into the realm where the trolls are and where the giants are.
These were cosmology, the evil people in the Thor film, right?
Yeah, well, and it's so fascinating to me because the trolls or the giants are seen as the big bad guys, right? And that's kind of our oversimplified version. However, a number of the gods, both in the Vanir and the Aesir, actually have relationships and children with these giants. And so it's much more murky than good versus bad, because you have an entire cosmology where there are children from these giantess women. And even before the gods came, they're kind of the big unknowns before Odin showed up, which predate, how did the gods come about? These are the ways that the gods came about when the world was quite literally fire and ice, and there were giants. And I'm sure there's probably text about where the giants came from, but that's so lost.
We don't have them.
We don't have a lot of the cosmology. And even there's children of the gods that are either never named or we lost their names. So there's a lot of overemphasis on certain gods. A lot of people consider Odin to be one of the most important gods in Norse paganism. And in a lot of ways, he absolutely is. And I can completely understand that. And I have a lot of personal practice that goes into Odin. However, it might also just be that that's the text that survived, or the guy translating took a particular interest in Odin because he was a bearded, all-knowing father figure. And when you are
that's familiar
Christian, that might jive with you better than, another god that focuses on fertility, who could, and in terms of the statues that we found, Freyr, who is Freya's brother, he has as many statues and places of worship set up to him, like in finding things in the stone and in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not as emphasized because there's this, who would you rather pick? Like the all-knowing, intense father figure with magic and is the king of the gods, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Or some guy that, he's a fertility god. He's like kind of important, But in Viking society, it may very well be that they were either both important or Odin was not considered important to everyone because he, as a warrior, he may be the god of the warrior Vikings, which are important in their society. But when you look at home and the way that women were viewed in the home, well, that would be Freyr's realm and Freya, and they might be as important as Odin, but that's not what we have on text, if you will.
Okay. So you started to talk a little bit about like the creation of the world. So can we dive into that a little bit and we'll maybe take us through creation and then maybe later on we can touch on destruction.
It's a lot. Right. Well, Ragnarok, everybody likes to talk about Ragnarok. It's
so we'll definitely get to that. We'll definitely get to Ragnarok, but what's the kind of creation story in Norse Paganism?
Fire and ice, giants and trolls, and kind of not creatures that, while magical and having influence in a magical way, were not considered necessarily intelligent, and they didn't look like people. And I find all of this super interesting in that there is a lot of emphasis on humankind or looking like a human. That's important in the story because there's a lot lost in how like the giants came to be.
But pre-human, there were these giants and trolls.
But pre-human, there's giants, there's trolls. They're not particularly intelligent, but they know magic. So there is some credence to power. And from a giant came Odin, like born out of a giant, kind of miraculously. Came like baby Odin.
Okay.
And baby Odin, who knows what happened when baby Odin was a baby, but quickly became, the Allfather.
Okay.
And that was when you saw the development of the actual Vanir and the Aesir and the two pools of gods. And there's politics behind the pools of gods. But in terms of just a blanket, where did the world come from? In Norse paganism, you have one of Loki's four children. Loki has a lot of kids, and they're all kind of important. But one of his kids is the snake that eats its tail under the belly of the world and keeps the world.
He's important in Ragnarok, I think.
Doing the world things. So you have that. But in terms of creation of people, that's where a lot of the history is just so spliced. And I think a lot of Reconstructionists, myself included, I focus so much on the world building, if you will, of the gods and the giants and the magic, and less on then how that affects where people come from. Particularly because if you compare it, at least in my experience from what I've read, there are people who've researched this for, this is actually what they have their degree in. So they might be they're far more informed than I am. But in Greek polytheism, you see a lot of interaction between gods and humans. And in Norse polytheism, that's not as big of a theme.
So
the whole interaction of like, oh, well, I took up a wife that was a human mortal girl. Like, it may have happened in the stories, but most of the stories have been magic stays with magic and gods stay around gods and giants and trolls. And then there are people just doing their thing, honoring these gods.
Okay. So
living out their life.
So for the contemporary Norse pagan, sort of creation is not really that important.
Nope.
The creation story. Okay.
And honestly, a lot of Norse pagans, it's always interesting is a lot of Norse pagans are actually atheist in their day-to-day life.
So this gets to a point that I wanted to talk about. So are these gods literal? Are they literal? There are some Christians who literally believe there's a male bearded, rogue god up there looking out for us, floating around up in the clouds somewhere. Is that the idea that there's actually Odin up there, there's actually Thor and Loki? Do some Norse pagans have that idea? Do others think they're more metaphorical, like symbolic representations?
Absolutely. The answer is yes to all regards. There's definitely a large number of pagans that see them as like trait-based influences. Like they don't actually believe that there's an Odin, but they do believe in the importance of knowledge or the importance of protection or whatever. So they put emphasis and stock and their focus into Odin because he represents those things. Not that he's actually some guy bestowing this wisdom, but because he's kind of an important figure and I want to show everybody that that's what I'm interested in. So Odin's the guy that I turn to. They just erected for the first time since literally the Viking times, a statue of, I want to say it's Thor. But the head of the religious organization in Iceland said, like, well, we don't really believe that Thor was real. Like, we just believe that this is a way to live your life, and these are some principles that we want to follow.
So the gods are kind of embodiments of
principles that we want to follow. Then there are definitely people who do believe very strongly. So I guess that would be considered like a soft polytheism. Then there are hard polytheists, of which there are plenty, that do sincerely believe that there are these forces in the world, be it actual different realms that we just don't understand, or literally floating in the sky somewhere. And I think that it definitely all has a place. I personally consider myself one that, particularly because, and we can definitely talk about it if you'd like, I do practice like Norse-based like magical practices. Not very into the, I'm actually controlling something, but more like trance-like states, meditation, which a lot of people would consider a lot of Norse magic more meditative than anything else. It's inducing trance-like states through sound and music. There's a word, reconnaissance maybe. There's a like using glass to make different pitches of sound and tonality and using that to induce like a meditative type state. That is those Norse pagans who practice a magic tend to use that as the magic that they practice, which is again more meditation than like what you would think of as Wiccans practicing spells and crafting. Not that doesn't happen at all, but I think a lot of people would separate
so it's
Norse
not really
pagans and
the Aleister Crowley conception of magic, he's this big figure in paganism and magic, and he had this idea that magic was I think he said something like the changing of consciousness through will or something, or like something like that. It's not so much that you are actually creating effects in the world through some kind of supernatural magical process.
Nope.
Okay. And so these meditative states, in those meditative states, are you focusing on particular gods as embodiments of these traits as a way to connect and reaffirm your connection to those values?
Yeah, I definitely do. I know a lot of different people will say that it's in those traits that's where they're going to do the reflection, and any kind of idea of communicating with gods will come through that. And that can mean for a hard polytheist, like I'm sitting down and I'm having a conversation with Heimdall about what I need to do next, because he is like an all-seer figure in paganism, quite literally the guy that sits and protects the realm from intruders. And there's a kind of idea of like, oh, well, I'm having a conversation versus I'm in those that trance, and I'm trying to embody those things that are important right now. So if I'm wondering about my home and what I should do next, either help build my home or, I don't know, relationship issue or whatever it could be, I'm going to sit and I'm going to go into this trance state, but also think about Frigga or Freya, either or. Many people find them quite literally interchangeable. And try to use that as the background of kind of do my best to focus the meditation instead of being like, oh, I'm just kind of thinking. If you have that idea in the back of your mind, then that can drive you into finding something more useful or focused on what you're actually going into this trance-like state for. If that makes sense. So like if I'm thinking about Frigga, who focuses on the home and the hearth, and my issue is how to best proceed with my family or family life, then that's going to help focus that meditation as opposed to just zoning out and not getting as much from it, because not that that isn't incredibly useful for lots of people, but it's more targeted if I'm using that as a way to kind of, again, not communicate with a God, particularly if you don't believe that is something that one can even do, but direct what your focus is actually on in terms of the problem of like, I have this problem, I'm going to use this as my guide. And hopefully that directs my thoughts into like what would be the best course of action. Okay.
So is this a kind of meditative practice? Is this a daily thing? Is this a daily thing that you do, or is it, and what does it look like?
Yeah, so definitely not a daily thing for me. I am on the lazy side of woo and like magic, if you will. I do a lot of tarot and rune reading, but I find that as like a fun thing. A lot of people find that as a very serious part of their practice, and I kind of just see it as like, this is a thing that I picked up. It's kind of like a game, like, but I will do the more spiritual parts of the practice in a sit down meditative way, like dark room, some candles, maybe some incense, couple of times a month. Okay. Every day I go out walking, and it's literally me and my headphones, and I go for a walk in my area, and that's when I do a lot of my own personal practice, I guess it would be. A lot of like, if I see trash on the ground, I clean it up. Volunteering, thinking of my students, like when I'm in the classroom, I see a lot of that actually being my biggest daily show or daily display of my practice as a Norse pagan.
So there's a spiritual meaning behind those kinds of acts.
Yeah, those daily actions are driven by my spiritual ideals, which are connected to my moral ideals as well. But every day I go for a walk for 45 minutes to an hour. And it's in that time that I do a lot of, doesn't quite count as like meditation because I'm in awareness of my surroundings, but a lot of reflection on my faith and the local connection that my gods have to the city that I live in, and how that fits, particularly in terms of Germanic diaspora. I'm always fascinated by the fact that there is a Pennsylvania Dutch movement, and there's actually an entire movement dedicated to the Pennsylvania Dutch folk religions, which is really cool to me as like a point of interest and study, but also then kind of, it's such a silly example. It's a silly way to explain it, but the book American Gods by Neil Gaiman the idea of bringing gods to modern America, which is a new place by and large for white people, and just what that means to bring old world gods into a new or modern context. So I do a lot of thoughts and reflection on that, and actually write an entire blog dedicated to that idea of the Norse gods in Philadelphia.
Really?
And what that means.
Oh, we can link to that if you want.
Sure.
So are there specific holidays associated with Norse paganism?
Yeah. So Yule is the big one. Yule's the one that everyone knows. That's the one that Wicca borrowed from a lot of different old religions.
Right. It's a kind of
an
amalgamation. Wicca's a whole
amalgamation.
syncretic thing on its own and very complicated. But
and Yule's the one that they took from like Norse paganism. A lot of Norse pagans do just follow the calendar of the wheel of the year, if you will. So they follow the Wiccan holidays. It's definitely the most established and the easiest way to follow a calendar.
Interesting.
So
is that because
people do that?
A lot of the traditional Viking holidays we just don't know about, so that they've kind of
hugely
kind of just
there's just a limited amount of information, and then
on
top of it, there's also a question of what holidays would look like, particularly because Vikings were such a movement-based people that how often were you establishing these holidays when you were constantly on the move? Like if you aren't established as a farmer culture, so many of those holidays in the wheel of the year focused on farming. And not to say that Vikings weren't farming, they absolutely were, but that is going to be less of an emphasis in your society if you're focused on seafaring.
Okay.
And just from like an anthropological standpoint, it would make sense that you wouldn't have huge major holidays dedicated to farming when farming wasn't your major source of development, industry, food, and that kind of thing. Because that's like the big thing with the wheel of the year. It's literally like, this is when you plant the seeds. This is when you dig up the things. This is when you harvest. This is like, it's a harvest calendar to know when to take each step. And Yule's kind of the like, well, let's have a bonfire because it's real freaking cold.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, a few things with the remaining time. We'll talk about kind of how you came into this practice, and then we'll touch on Ragnarök, and then we'll talk kind of about the social context of this. So let's talk about how you learned about Norse paganism, why it appeals to you, how you came into this practice.
Yeah. So I was very young when I first started finding books on like being a psychic, and literally found one in my library in elementary school. And so from that, I was just like, wow, I want to do this thing. Like, I want to be able to control these kind of things. And I mean, it's very silly, but it's essentially picking up like Harry Potter and being like, magic? And then finding out that there are people who actually do magic, and having that idea of like, whoa, I can be Harry Potter. Let's do this thing. So I found paganism through being interested in magic and fantasy, Lord of the Rings, and that kind of thing. And then most of what you find in a Borders or a Barnes and Noble is tied to Wicca. And it never really fit well with me. Never really wanted to do a coven thing. And so a lot of my pagan practice has just been focused on having my altar and honoring a variety of deities, originally Artemis and Freya, moving away from Artemis eventually, and focusing specifically on Norse paganism. Why Norse paganism? I went to Japan because for a while I was like, Shinto makes sense to me. I kind of dig this idea of spirits and honoring the land.
Traditional Japanese religion. A lot of nature spirits and nature gods.
Exactly. And when I went to Japan, I focused a lot on going to shrines, both Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples. And while I absolutely had like this deep love and appreciation, I just kind of decided it wasn't going to be for me for a lot of reasons of just not understanding the context of Shinto as somebody that did not grow up in Japan. Not that you cannot be, Shinto and live elsewhere. You absolutely can. And there are thousands of people who do. But it just didn't fit right with me. I felt like there was a lot that I was missing, and my understanding wasn't going to be as deep. But in that year was when I kind of realized that spirituality was really important to me, and I wanted to actually refine my practice and figure out what fit instead of just kind of going through the motions and knowing like I kind of care, but I don't kind of care, and I'm kind of an atheist, but I'm not an atheist, and I don't know what all that means. And I wasn't really an angry atheist anymore. Like I had my time when I like hated Christians and I hated religion,
but you've evolved since then.
I've like come out of that. Thank God. I came out of that, and I basically took a number of years just trying to do research to see what fit and what worked, and that Norse paganism kind of fit and worked based on what I find most important. In my own life. And so
would you consider yourself a squishy atheist, or I don't want to apply labels to you,
yeah,
but
I might be. I don't know. It's interesting because I definitely started as an atheist that kind of just took some pagan ideas and ran with it, which makes a lot of atheists really mad to say, because those new atheists have like some hard-lined opinions about how to practice atheism, which is ironic in and of itself. But I think since in these last couple of years, particularly seeing how Shinto fit within the Japanese context and the idea of land spirits, and more honoring like nature and the different things that I would feel when I was on my walks or whatever I was doing, I think I'm actually at this very peculiar kind of point where I'm becoming less of an atheist and more of a hard polytheist, which is hilarious because, I didn't grow up with a religion, particularly. So that's something that taking 26 years to figure out how I felt about gods in general is interesting. So yeah, I would say that I definitely was a squishy atheist, and am now in this time that I'm becoming more focused on hard polytheism, particularly the way in which I feel spirits and spiritual connections to local lands is something that fits well enough in my brain that I can actually see that being like a very real, tangible thing. When I've never actually had that experience before until very recently. Like so, the tangible, real part of spirits. Particularly.
Is the natural world a big part of Norse paganism in general, or is it just your particular practice?
No, it's definitely a big part of Norse paganism and paganism in general.
That's true, yeah.
Just because, and not necessarily even in like an environmental aspect. If we connect Norse paganism back to Viking ages and like the reconstructive part of it, it's just understanding the natural world is inherently like and immensely important. If you're going onto the water into the ocean for months and days and having to know how to survive and I feel like there's a deeper, like a kind of respect that Norse pagans had to have, because if a lot of the lore comes from, will Thor kill you or not by having a storm while you were out at sea. And that's like, obviously storms aren't caused by a god we know how storms are caused. However, this respect and reverence of nature is an important part of Norse paganism. And I think now, because of the modern view of paganism, is even more so emphasized than people in the practice, just because paganism is so frequently tied and connected to environmentalism and, again, the wheel of the year. If you're a Norse pagan practicing the wheel of the year, you're thinking about nature in some regard, because your holidays are literally based on what the plants are doing and the seasons. So
Okay. Well, I think the time has come. Ragnarok, what is it?
Ragnarok's the end of the world. It is. Many people think that it is completely based on Loki. Loki is kind of seen as the Norse devil, if you will, which he is actually not in any regard. Norse paganism. The beauty, I think, a lot of people see in paganism is the fact that there is a balance, that chaos is a necessary part of life. And it's not that Christianity is absolved of that, but I think there's less of a hard line. Like, there's much more of a recognition that Loki is like completely necessary and considered like not the opposite of Odin by any means, but just a necessary part of life. Like, that chaos and not knowing what's going on and whatnot is important. So
it exists and should be revered, chaos.
And yeah, it exists and it's part of what makes life. So as much as you want to think of knowledge as an immensely important part of life, or protecting your family is an immensely important part of life, so is shit happening that you didn't expect.
That is a part of life for sure.
And
so
in terms of Ragnarok, it's the destruction of the world, as some people would argue, caused by Loki and his kids. He has really wild kids. He's birthed a couple of them, which is super interesting in terms of gender and sex and sexuality in Norse paganism. Loki is a completely gender fluid. He morphs different genders all the time. Has been a mother. Not too many gods can hold that title of also a mom and a guy. And what's interesting is I've been researching this recently, and a lot of people are actually saying that it's not very clear whether or not Ragnarok actually was a Viking principle or a Viking idea, or if it had been created in the rebuilding of the religion, or like the study, not the rebuilding of the religion, but the study of the religion in the late 1800s. Which is super fascinating because it's considered like a kind of a thing that you need to know about. Tenet of the history of Norse, like that's in the Norse mythos.
Right.
But it may be completely explained incorrectly, which is, so I'm still just learning about what that means in terms of, okay, well, this is kind of the way that the world was supposed to end.
But it may not have been original.
But it may not have even been an original story at all. I think a lot of, in terms of the going back to the question with nature and the reverence of nature and taking care of the earth, you'll definitely hear a lot of Norse pagans talk about Ragnarok not coming from mystical ideas, but Ragnarok
it was this
coming from
fight between the different gods and the giants, right? That destroyed the world and killed
all awful,
killed the gods, and a lot of violence.
A lot of violence, a lot of treachery in a way. Like Loki has always played this role of like, are you or aren't you on the god's side? And that was the decision, quote unquote, decision of him to not be on the god's side anymore. This is kind of oversimplified, but that's also a big point where people are arguing, like, is it true, or is this, how influenced in this is this in Christianity in terms of the great betrayal, if you will, like Loki's great betrayal being connected to Judas's great betrayal. Like, was that a thing that Vikings came up with, or is that a thing that they were writing about what the religion was and used their own influence of, well, treachery is of the utmost sin, so let's make Loki a treacherous figure. Because that is a big part of it is, Loki, you have a chance to stand with the gods and then fight off the giants, and it's going to be, we'll win again. But Ragnarok is particularly like the gods losing, and part of that influence was the betrayal piece of it. Kind of like Loki brought on Ragnarok because he wanted chaos that desperately, or got that jealous or frustrated about the gods' kind of consistent rejection of him.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's a wild story.
It really is. I mean, we don't have time to go too deep into it, but it's it's a thing to read. All right, it's lots of crazy battles, and it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing. So let's move on to the white supremacist elephant in the room.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of, and recently actually, there was, I think, a few people who were arrested for some kind of plot to do something hateful against, I don't know, a minority group of some kind, and they said that they were part of this Odinistic Norse group, and apparently this is not a isolated event. There is this
not at all
strand of white supremacy and hatred. So if we could just talk about that and where that came from, and why do you think that appeals to those
Absolutely.
kinds of people?
So obviously Norse paganism comes from Nordic countries, and that it's tied to Germanic countries. There's actually a whole occultism of Nazism that is interesting, and very much also might not be 100% real. Like it is, there were Nazis that were occultists, but this whole like grand mythos of Nazis all secretly being like trying to bring back the old religion and the old ways is not at all, like Hitler was not trying to do that at all, and was not interested in that, and actually thought those people were crazy. So,
when Hitler thinks you're crazy, you know you've gone off the rails.
Right. So in the 60s and 70s, when Norse polytheism was really coming back in some kind of way, there actually was a big push of seeing what was happening in the 1910s and 1920s, 1930s Germany. And there was an entire movement dedicated to, it was Ariosophy, I think it's called. It's literally like Aryan philosophy, like some combination of that word. And it was mysticism and occultism as tied to like prevailing the Aryan race. So there was mysticism happening connected to like these ideas of blood and right to practice these kind of faiths. In the 60s and 70s, when all of this was coming together, I think there was I mean, not that I have the history of gangs and white supremacy down by any means, but there was this idea that we're practicing this as the children of German people, like we're American, but you need to have blood ties to these lands or to these gods to be listened to and to be heard by the gods. And there was a lot of exclusionary practices, and there still are today, where this started. And I mean, if you think of like Thor's hammer is a really popular symbol, but it's also a really popular symbol that denotes that you are a white supremacist. And it's like a tattoo that gangs will get to show that they are white supremacists, particularly in like prison gang systems. Again, I'm not a researcher of prison gangs, but there is a correlation between white men in prison systems that are part of the Aryan Brotherhood or some other gangs, that the view is that Christianity, here's the crazy, Christianity was affected by Judaism, and therefore it is tainted. And it is not to be practiced because it is too connected to Jewish religion and Jewish people. So you cannot practice Christianity if you are going to be pure, the purest of the pure. And so they turned to the old religion.
So Christianity's out. They're looking for an alternative, and
they're looking for an alternative, and there's
these...
this religion that has no influence of Judaism and no influence of Christianity, really,
and is rooted in Aryan, traditions, and
and you have got like Heimdall is said to be the lightest the lightest god, and he's beautiful. And like, this is translated in like the poetic and the prose Eddas, like he is a beautiful god and he is light and white. And there's this idea that meant that he was like so pale and that's why he's pretty. And there are a lot of modern interpreters that are like, no, they were just saying that he had like blonde hair. They weren't trying to like say like, because he has blonde hair, he is beautiful. Those were just two different traits. But when you can interpret things how you want because it's pieced together, somebody said, oh my gosh, that's clearly proof positive that, you know, to be beautiful, you need to be white. And therefore this religion is saying these like completely unfounded, ridiculous things, particularly if you actually think of Norse paganism is so, you know, there's a concept of the in and the out. And the in being the gods and the out being the giants. Mm-hmm. But that's a concept that white supremacists will use, like we are in and you are out because you are lesser than, like non-Aryan or whatever. But what they kind of casually forget, they being like white supremacists who practice Norse paganism and try to use that as an example of like your all-knowing, like white power, super Aryan religion. While yes, obviously it was practiced by Norse people and Vikings and whatnot, the gods had relationships with the lesser than. Like they had children with giants and fell in love with people unlike them who were not considered like perfect beings because they weren't gods. So there's this added, I think a lot of people who are vehemently like opposed to this like pro-hate heathenry kind of see the myths and they're like, this doesn't make sense that you can draw these conclusions because did we talk about Thor wearing a dress? Like, yes, he's a warrior, but he's also cross-dressed. And Freya got to choose her lovers and choose the slain. Like, she's not the perfect housewife. There is no goddess that is like a perfect demonstration of like housewifery. Like Frigga potentially had relations with a housemaid. So there's a lot of things that you kind of, and this is both the beauty, but also a destructive part of paganism is you can really pick and choose what you want to see.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this, so one potential reason why it was adopted by these hate groups seems to be that because it's a Reconstructionist tradition and they're drawing on these fragmented sources, they were able to kind of construct a tradition that affirmed their hateful beliefs already.
Hatred, exactly. That's exactly, you know, what it is.
Okay.
And they're able to create like Odin and Thor are seen, you know, there's so many things that they would dislike. Like Odin chose to, you know, he's disabled,
with the blind,
the seer, and practices satyr, which is a female magic that is the fragmented sources we have. It's basically like a female magic that may have involved penetration of some kind. And if Odin practiced that, then we can make certain conclusions about, one, he's the biggest and the baddest and the roughest and the toughest because he wants all knowledge. That includes this magic that is not for men, and yet he does it anyway because it's valuable to him. But they don't think of that. They just kind of see like, oh, well, he's a warrior god and he takes the slain from Valhalla. So they took that part of Odin
the other part.
And ignored all the other parts that are, you know, well, you know, he's also a disabled guy that practices lady magic that might involve certain things that you are very against. And we're going to ignore that part of Odin, which we actually had that on written record. Like you can't even make it up. Like
so that is actually in the sources that we do have.
Yeah, he is
recovered
he
from.
Practices satyr, And the development in our knowledge of Seder is very, very limited. But what we do have, we know it was a female-focused, female-centered magic practice.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some sources that kind of lead to like there was some sensuality to it of some way. But that's when it starts to really break down.
Okay.
But 100% a female practice, and 100% Odin is revered as a god because he practices this despite it being, you know, a magic that men aren't really allowed to have the knowledge of.
Okay.
And he had been given the knowledge of.
So just looking a little more broadly at pagan movements in general, to what extent do you think these, you know, paganism, a lot of this started coming up around the 1970s, kind of in parallel and in conversation with New Age movements. To what extent do you think that the paganism is kind of a reaction to mainstream religions that often reject the queer community? I mean, I know from my dealings with my limited dealings with paganism and pagan communities, oftentimes they are very open and friendly to people of all sexualities and genders. Do you see that as kind of because a lot of these mainstream religions, and as they are sometimes practiced, are often hostile to queer community?
Yeah, so I definitely think that's a huge part of it. I definitely think that's a huge part of why a lot of people turn to paganism is because they had negative experiences with mainstream religions, usually Christianity. I think a lot of pagans, you see that in that, and I mean, probably a controversial statement, but I know a lot of pagans that really quite aren't over feeling frustration and anger towards Christianity. And in certain experiences, of course, it's your experience. I can understand that. In others, I'm, over like, Christians didn't steal our holidays. Like they did. Easter's Easter in the Christian sense. And like, we really need to stop pretending that like there's some global conspiracy that Christianity stole all of our holidays, because our holidays were chosen by a guy in the 1950s who like founded Gardenian Wicca as a practice. And like, that's not a bad thing. And that's not a slight against Wicca, but knowing your history is important in that regard. I think that what is interesting now is there is a development in terms of paganism where you start to see branches such as Norse Paganism, which there are folks that are vehemently pro whatever you need to make yourself happy, be it queer or different races, like whomever, join. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
Find what works for you. That's
kind
the
of
beauty of paganism.
Openness.
There's not a Bible that says what you need to do or whatever. You can pick what works for you and what doesn't. But there's also, there are differences like in terms of Wicca, which is just easy to talk about because it is so popularized.
Right. A lot of people have heard of it.
And there are branches of Wicca that are very vehemently anti-trans. And since this fertility symbols are a man and a woman, a lot of LGBT folk are kind of like, well, I need that to be a little different, because in Wicca, while yes, I get the whole man-woman thing, that's important to that faith, that kind of doesn't jive with what I find important. I don't find the great balance of like masculine and feminine energy to be the way in which the world works. And that is really a core tenet of Wicca. So then you have these other pagan practices that either aren't as refined, such as Norse paganism. It's a little more work to, it's definitely a religion where people joke and say, you just need to be willing to read an extensive amount of stuff. And some of it's super boring. Or Hellenic paganism, where while there's definitely not like a blanket, here's the god of being a gay man or a lesbian woman, you have a polytheism that there's more open to it. And there's not like Wicca. Wicca has it's definitely more strict in terms of paganism. There's a certain way to do things. For traditional Wicca, you have to be part of a coven.
Right, because
it's more organized.
These articulated
ways in which to
practice,
which is, again, not a bad thing. That works for lots of people. But for those that might need something different, the world of different, like Kemeticism, or like, which is Egyptian, like the focus on Egyptian gods, or Hellenic, which is Greek, Norse, you can do a little bit more because it's less organized, which is where you get a lot of eclectic type of pagans that piece together what they want. Or even Reconstructionists that are like, nope, this is what I follow. These are what I do. This is what they would have done. This is what I'm going to do. But are able to bend a little bit more because the rules just aren't there. Like, yeah, I'm sure there was not a law that said LGBT people were completely fine in Viking times, because there weren't terms for that in that way.
Right.
That existed. We know that existed, but there wasn't.
It was conceived of differently.
Wasn't. It was conceived of differently. But we know that Loki is a gender shifting god, and that Odin practiced a magic only fit for women. So there was fluidity there that some people find very comfortable to have. Like, I know I definitely find those facets of the gods like important to highlight. And I researched a lot because I wanted to find a paganism that, or a polytheism that fit with certain things that I find and hold really valuable. And one of those things are that fluidity. And to even find a god that shifts genders was kind of like, oh my goodness, like, wow, like that's kind of cool, because there's only so many gods in the world that have ever done something like that. And the fact that it's written down in the stories and the history as being something that's kind of fundamental to like Loki's identity, as he has had children that then were fundamental in the way in which the world was formed and also then destroyed. If you follow the Ragnarök story, like that's really interesting to like note and to highlight.
Yeah.
So I think people that are looking for something different,
this appeals to them.
Find it. Yeah.
Okay. So why don't we just wrap up with one final question here. So, you know, there's been a lot of terrible things in the news recently. And if there's kind of one teaching from Norse paganism, from your faith, that you could offer the world that would be useful, or that you think is important, what would it be?
I think the biggest teaching would absolutely be how valuable community is and how community shifts all over the world. So community doesn't mean just your home. It means everywhere really that you go and you bring with you. And I could only wish that if that was a more normalized idea, that a lot of these awful things could either be lessened, of course, or just that if you need to go somewhere to be safe, that your community is now the place that you are safe. So thinking of, you know, refugees need to find safety, and that should be the utmost thought that I think, you know, the American people should have when wondering, like, should we or shouldn't we open border? There's really no question in my mind. And if people took that idea of community and applied it in practice, then I think there wouldn't be questions in anybody else's mind either, because it's where you're safe and where you're protected. And that doesn't mean I was born here, therefore this is what it is.
So building communities wherever you are.
Wherever you are.
Good thing.
And then moving around. Positive. That's not a bad thing.
All right.
That doesn't make it lesser or whatever.
Well, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great to have you, and maybe we'll talk again.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Ash.
Bye, Phil.
Bye.